1 bottle of DeltaG Performance versus 3 bottles of Ketone-IQ from HVMN. Which one do you think increased my blood BHP levels more? Well, that's what we're going to find out in this video. So let's start with talking about the ingredients, because understanding what those products contain and how they metabolize in the body is crucial to understanding and interpreting my findings or my measurements. So on the DeltaG side, we have the original ketone, the Oxford ketone ester that was developed in 2003 as part of a joint venture between the National Institute of Health and the University of Oxford. And the DARPA paid for all of that because they wanted to develop a product or a compound that could improve the performance of the tactical operators in the military. Mental performance, cognitive performance, as well as athletic performance or physical performance. And so along the way, that seemed to pan out. The product worked, and they came up with a ketone ester that is still the same one that we find in DeltaG today. Now, HVMN or Ketone-IQ, on the other hand, is not an ester. And that's where some of the confusion comes in, because the truth is that until a couple of years ago, HVMN also marketed a ketone ester, the same ketone ester in fact, but that was in 2017 when the company sold what's called Ketone 1.0. And that was a ketone ester. It was relatively expensive and mostly affordable by elite athletes or by, maybe law enforcement personnel that needed to improve their performance. But along the way, HVMN lost a license to market that ketone ester. And so they had to launch a new product. And that was in 2022 when HVMN launched Ketone-IQ. And Ketone-IQ is no longer an ester. It does no longer contain an ester. Instead, it contains butanediol. And that makes a difference. So let's talk about what that means from a chemical perspective and from an energetics perspective. So let's look at what happens in your body when a ketone ester metabolizes versus when butanediol metabolizes. And I know it's a little bit nerdy, but stick with me because that's important to understand why you see different results as far as your blood BHP levels are concerned. So when a ketone monoester, such as the one in DeltaG, metabolizes in the body, it leads to 1 part BHP, beta hydroxybutyrate, another half a part BHP, and half a part of acetoacetate or ACAC. And if you combine all of those, if you add everything up, then you realize you have 1.5 parts of BHP and half a part of ACAC. So you have a 3-to-1 ratio of BHP to ACAC, and that's important. So stick with me. On the Ketone-IQ side, you have half a part of BHP and half a part of ACAC. So it's basically, if you compare those two, you have almost like, a part of the ketone monoester is the butanediol. And that's in fact what it is, because the monoester in DeltaG is the ketone component, which is, metabolized into BHP, and the alcohol component, which is the butanediol. And in Ketone-IQ, you only have the butanediol. So you have half a part BHP and half a part of ACAC in Ketone-IQ. So you have a 1-to-1 ratio of BHP to ACAC. And that is crucial because the higher the BHP to ACAC ratio is, the more energy your mitochondria in the form of ATP can produce. And more energy production means greater benefits if we want to oversimplify it. And so looked at it from a different perspective. 10 grams of DeltaG ketones contain 3 times as much BHP as 10 grams of Ketone-IQ, simply because of their different ingredients, right? So what does it mean now in terms of effectiveness, in terms of changes in BHP levels in the blood? So what I did is I used my Ketomojo and I used my trusted BioSense, my breath ketone monitor, and I tested my blood and breath ketone levels before ingesting the product, and then at 30, 60, and 90 minutes, and then a couple of hours later just to see how the long-term effects would be. The results were surprising. I suspected what would happen, but I did not expect the extent of the discrepancy between those two products. So if we look at the table, we can see that before I started with the DeltaG Performance, and that contains 27 grams of the ketone ester, versus 3 bottles containing each 10 grams, so 30 grams in total, of Ketone-IQ. And before I did the test, and I did this over a couple of days, I repeated those tests a couple of times just to see if, there would be any major discrepancies. But on that one day, I had 0.3 mmol per liter of blood ketones or BHP, So I was not quite in nutritional ketosis, just some residual with the DeltaG. And on the day I took the Ketone-IQ, I had 0.2. So very comparable. Within 30 minutes, my BHP levels after consuming that one bottle of DeltaG Performance increased to 4.8 mmol per liter. That's a significant increase. Whereas on the flip side with Ketone-IQ, 3 bottles of Ketone-IQ, BHP only increased to 1.3 mmol per liter. And then you can see as time goes by, the 60 and 90 minute mark, we obviously see a drop off, but the difference between DeltaG and Ketone-IQ is almost it's about a 3x, And that makes a lot of sense because with DeltaG Performance, I actually get 3 times as much BHP as I do with Ketone-IQ. In fact, if you really want to compare side by side, I actually consumed slightly less DeltaG than I did Ketone-IQ. So 27 grams versus 30 grams. So the difference might have been even a little bit more had I consumed 30 grams of DeltaG, but the bottle only has 27 and I didn't want to, measure it up from a second bottle. So that was quite interesting and expected to a degree, but I didn't expect such a difference at the 30-minute mark. And then out of curiosity, of course, I also used my Biosense breath ketone monitor to measure my acetone, my ACE levels or the acetone in my breath. And I saw similar results, but not quite as stark. That was interesting. So before I started, I had 2 ACEs in both cases, which roughly corresponds to the 0.2 mmol per liter. And then the increase was slower, but more sustained. In fact, I retained those ACE levels for several hours, which was interesting. Whereas my blood ketone levels, kept dropping off, and then I hovered, in the case of DeltaG, at the 1.0 mmol per liter for a couple of hours before they dropped off more. So that was interesting. And then, of course, I repeated the same test with lower concentrations. So I have the DeltaG Gold, which one serving contains only 5 grams of ketone ester and 1 bottle of Ketone-IQ, so 10 grams. And I noticed comparable results. In fact, 5 grams of DeltaG outperformed slightly the 10 grams of Ketone-IQ, which again, overall, everything combined, all of my tests combined showed me that the same amount of ketone ester from DeltaG outperformed Ketone-IQ, the same amount of Ketone-IQ by 200 to 300%, so 2 to 3x. And that again goes back to how the body metabolizes those ingredients and how much BHP each of those ingredients contains. So that was interesting. And now you might say, well, but DeltaG is significantly more expensive. Well, hold your horses, because we're going to break it down and normalize the pricing based on the amount of BHP you get from each of the products and how much of an increase in terms of blood BHP levels you get. But before we talk about pricing, let's talk about flavor and taste real quick, because that's also important for many users. If something tastes terribly and you don't want to take it, it doesn't really matter how effective it is. Now, the cool thing is with DeltaG, there are different products, flavors, and concentrations available. There is a DeltaG Tactical, which is the most potent product they have, and it contains a whopping 32 grams of the Oxford ketone ester, and it tastes pretty harsh because it's not sweetened or anything. It's just straight up the ester, and it's meant to be diluted or mixed with water. So what I do is when I work out, I either take it as a shot, which tastes pretty harsh, I have to say, or I pour it into my water bottle and just drink it throughout, my workout. DeltaG Performance, which is the one I used extensively during this testing, is flavored. So it's very pleasant to drink, and it's kind of comparable to Ketone-IQ from a taste perspective. The only downside of DeltaG Performance is that it's flavored with sucralose, which I'm not a huge fan of. I'd rather prefer stevia or monk fruit. But DeltaG Performance contains 27 grams of the ketone ester. So you get a little bit less, but still very potent and meant for athletic performance or to improve athletic performance. And then my favorite product I want to say is the DeltaG Gold Ketone Coffee Booster. So it's also straight up ester. It comes in a small glass bottle, and it has 6 servings a bottle, so you get approximately 5 grams of ketone ester, and I just pour it into my morning coffee, and it's great to improve mental performance. I do this in the morning before I start writing, before I start recording YouTube videos. It just helps me be a little bit, faster in my head, especially when I have to talk a language that is not my native language, like English. But it's unflavored. And then there is the DeltaG Ketone Health, which is one of the products I haven't tested, so I can't really tell much about it, but it's also flavored. It's similar to DeltaG Performance based on what I've read, but I haven't tried it yet. And it contains only 10 instead of the 27 grams of the ketone ester. So that's the main difference between DeltaG Performance and DeltaG Health. Ketone-IQ, on the other hand, is available in only one flavor. It is flavored. It wasn't in the past. It was pretty harsh tasting in the past, I remember that, but now it's flavored with monk fruit and I think and stevia. And it has a pleasant taste. I mean, it's still a little harsh because it's butanediol. It's an alcohol at the end of the day. Not ethanol, but an alcohol nonetheless. And you can get it in different sizes. You can give it like in little shot bottles that have 10 grams of butanediol each. Those are the ones that I've tested. And you can find them online or in some grocery stores, even like Whole Foods and Sprouts. Or you can get the larger bottle, which contains several servings. So you can pour out as much as you want to, but one serving has still the 10 grams of butanediol. So now let's look at pricing, because that's where it starts getting interesting, especially if you want to leverage ketones on an ongoing basis. Now, I'm going to show the table of the pricing table up here in the video so you can see what's going on. But if you just look at the list price, how much do you pay for, a box of DeltaG Tactical or Performance or Gold or Ketone-IQ, the big bottle or the shots? Then you might say, well, one might be more expensive than the other. But you really have to look at not only what is the price per serving, but more importantly, I think, what is the price per gram adjusted to BHP, to how much BHP you get. And as we have concluded, you get 3 times as much BHP with each gram of a ketone ester, like the one in DeltaG, versus in butanediol. So you really have to multiply the price per gram of butanediol, of a product containing butanediol, to compare it to a product containing the ketone ester. And if you look at it, we can actually see that DeltaG is less expensive. Even though the price per gram is more expensive, but normalized or adjusted for the amount of BHP, DeltaG is less expensive. In fact, it looks like DeltaG Tactical, which is one of the most expensive products, if you just look at the list price, is actually the least expensive if you look at the price per or adjusted for BHP. So that's interesting. And if you look at the Ketone-IQ shots, they are the most expensive product, which is, not necessarily surprising because, if you buy smaller versions of something, it's always more expensive than if you buy it in bulk. But just a comparison, there is a 50% price increase from getting DeltaG Tactical, the most potent product, versus the Ketone-IQ shots. So that's important to understand when you compare, apples to apples. You really have to break it down based on the value you get out of the product instead of just comparing list price or the price per serving, which could be misleading. Now, I have a discount code for you for DeltaG. I'm going to link it down below. That gets you an additional discount. You can also use that with a subscription, which also reduces the price. And now, before we wrap it up, let me tell you how I use exogenous ketones, and in particular DeltaG. And so I already mentioned I like to put in a few grams of the ketone ester into my morning coffee. It tastes very pleasant with black coffee. I like my coffee black. It already has some sort of, a little bit of bitterness. By adding the ketones, it barely changes the flavor profile. So it still tastes very good. In a way, you might say it kind of tastes maybe a little bit like Irish coffee. So you can kind of, feel like there is an alcohol in there, but it's just the ketones. But it doesn't change the flavor dramatically. I really like that. And that's what I use on a daily basis. And then for certain high-intensity workouts, like I do CrossFit, and if I really want to crush it in the gym, I use either DeltaG Tactical or Performance. And I did this just for testing to see how much of a difference it makes to my athletic performance. I did it last year during my annual Murph challenge. It's a grueling CrossFit workout where you wear a weight vest, 20 pounds, and you run a mile, you do 100 pull-ups, you do 200 push-ups, 300 squats, and then you run another mile, all with a weighted vest. And I always do that as the end of a 48-hour fast. So I don't eat anything for 2 days, then I do the workout, and then I break my fast. And I did it 2 years ago, and measured my time. And then I did it again last year, running on DeltaG ketones, and I improved my time by 10 minutes. A significant improvement. I could feel it, and I could then see it obviously on the clock. And so, if I have grueling workouts, especially when I'm fasted, I use DeltaG to just perform better. and to improve my recovery afterwards, because obviously doing that fasting and then doing high intensity workouts cause a lot of oxidative stress, and you really want to do everything you can to help your body recover and don't run into some sort of overtraining, That's what I do. I'm not on a ketogenic diet on a daily basis anymore. Obviously, if you are, ketones can help, but I just use it with my animal-based diet to improve my mental performance on certain days where I have to, use my head a lot, like recording videos, recording a podcast, or writing research-intense blog posts. Now, if you want to learn more about DeltaG versus Ketone-IQ, check out my blog post, has some more information, goes a little bit more into the history of both companies to see why, there is some confusion around why Ketone-IQ is not an ester anymore, even though HVMN used to have one, etc. So check all of that out. I hope you like this video. I hope you like the results. Were they surprising to you? Did you think that one would be significantly more effective than the other? Let me know in the comments, and I hope I'll see you in the next video.